Today on The Science of Creativity, I'm interviewing Professor James Kaufman of the University of Connecticut. Dr. Kaufman is a legendary and influential creativity researcher. He's a tenured professor of educational psychology. He's published 50 books and hundreds of scientific articles. Dr. Kaufman is going to talk about his new book, The Creativity Advantage. His new book shows how creativity benefits your mental health and well-being. He calls it Self-transformational creativity. Stay tuned for today's interview with Dr. James Kaufman. Welcome to The Science of Creativity, your home for insights and inspiration about art, design, and invention. I'm your host, Dr. Keith Sawyer. My mission is to inspire you with stories of brilliant creators and world-changing inventions. You'll learn about the latest psychological studies and gain insights about creativity that will help you reach your full creative potential. Professor James Kaufman is one of the leading creativity researchers in the world. His books have been translated into Chinese, Korean, Polish, Russian, Spanish, and Turkish. Dr. Kaufman is an expert on creativity and meaning, creativity assessment. Basically, he's an expert on everything you could think of that's related to creativity. And you don't have to take my word for it, just look at his book titles. They include the 2019 Cambridge Handbook of Creativity, the 2018 book, The Nature of Human Creativity, both of them with Cambridge University Press. His 50 books have been co-authored with some of the legendary stars in the field of creativity. These are people that I hope to have on the podcast in the coming years, from Dean Keith Simonton to John Baer, Jonathan Plucker, Robert Sternberg. I have many of these books on my own office shelves. Every creativity researcher has learned from Dr. Kaufman's books. In addition to the books, on his CV, you'll find 16 pages of journal articles single-spaced and 11 pages of book chapters single-spaced. In today's interview, Dr. Kaufman talks about his 2023 book called The Creativity Advantage. The book explains how engaging in creative acts improves your mental health and well-being. He's identified 5 advantages to creativity: self-insight, healing, connection, drive, and legacy. I'm delighted to have Dr. Kaufman on the show. I'm delighted to welcome Professor James Kaufman to The Science of Creativity. James and I are about the same age, and we both got into creativity research in the 1990s. We've known each other for a very long time. James, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. This should be fun.
James, you are a legendary creativity researcher. You're a tenured professor at a top research university. And my first question is, could you describe what creativity research is and how it's done? It's because a lot of people claim to be experts about creativity. We've got business executives, we've got popular musicians, and many of them have published books about creativity. So what's different about creativity research?
What's different to me is that although creativity researchers include people in education and in business and all sorts of areas, creativity research still takes a certain scientific approach and does the kind of theory and empirical studies that you would associate with any type of science. Certainly, there are many different types of expertise. So you have people who have lived experience and things like that. And I think that is absolutely interesting and often very valid. But to me, the key differences is that when you have somebody who is talking out of their life experience, it can be very interesting. The key is that it may or may not generalize to other people, whereas the creativity research, at least ideally, would be much more likely to generalize to the average person or the average person who's interested in being creative.
Sure, I understand. So that if you're reading something that's creativity research, it's going to have a more general meaning or usefulness to just about anyone. Is that right?
Yeah. So like right now, one of the projects that I'm working on is a book on theater with a dear friend of mine who's a composer named Dana Rowe. And we're interviewing a whole lot of theater people, actors and actresses and producers, composers, and people who work in tech. All of these people are theater experts based on their experience. But one of our goals is to kind of integrate and synthesize and compile all these different experiences and advice and thoughts into a larger narrative. So even in this case, not scientifically, but to take more of a forest view than a tree view.
Yes, you're getting the underlying essence of creativity in that area, right? Not just one person. So then the message has more resonance, I guess you could say, right?
I certainly hope so.
Right. It's similar to something I've been doing in recent years. I've been interviewing professional artists and designers, and each one has their own unique story. But by using some relatively rigorous methodologies, I've been able to identify, like I said, the underlying essence of art and design creativity. So you're doing the same thing with your new book. And it's, would you say, actors and producers? What sort of people?
Pretty much anybody who has a life in the theater. And it's funny because we're not really trying to do this in a comparable way in terms of it's not, I mean, frankly, it's not a rigorous methodology because it's not designed to be science, but rather a narrative, ideally an interesting and useful book for, let's say, parents and teenagers to read together. Tentatively, it's So You Have a Theater Kid. And so we've been talking to performers, we've been talking to creators, people who work all sides. So producers and sound designers, front of house. And it's, I mean, part of it is this idea that, I mean, kind of like the way that you can be creative in anything, you can pursue theater in so many different ways. And everybody has their own interesting story and background.
Well, it's fascinating to hear that because I don't know if a lot of people know this about you, but if you read your book, The Creativity Advantage, your new book, which I just finished reading, you describe being a playwright. Even before you went to graduate school for creativity research, you were a successful playwright. So say a little bit about that.
Absolutely. I think that successful is a generous term, but
Right.
I wanted to be a writer my whole life. The earliest memories I have, in a lot of ways beyond typical family memories, are writing and wanting to. First, it was stories, and I wrote fiction about anything I could think of. And I was very into journalism. At one point, I wanted to be a sports writer. And in high school, I wrote for three different local newspapers as a stringer, where I would cover everything from high school water polo and things like that. And in college, I was very lucky. I studied with one of the great American novelists, T. Caragison Boyle, who was an amazing mentor. And
Yeah, right.
maybe about a year ago, I found this box of printouts of stories I'd given him with his comments in the back, and just his kind of, detailed, really thoughtful comments about my work, and generally incredibly accurate looking back. My senior year of college, I was a double major, creative writing and psychology, and I was planning on getting my MFA. I remember this is before the internet took care of all this for you. I wrote to 11 or 12 different places for their application materials. And I still remember there was one school that said every year we graduate 20 people with MFAs in creative writing. And every year there are 30 jobs in the entire country for people with creative writing MFAs. If you can do anything else but this,
Right.
I mean, probably it was meant to be inspirational and yes, I can do this. But honestly, I thought, oh man, I mean, I figured I would write no matter what. And so the only other thing I knew was psychology. Both of my parents are psychologists, and my sister is a psychologist. And I also had been working with a psychology professor as an undergrad, a wonderful, wonderful man named John Horn, he was one of the creators of a very well known intelligence theory on fluid and crystallized intelligence. I went into PsycInfo and I typed in whatever I could think of that sounded interesting. And I just looked up who studied it, and I applied very scattershot to 13 programs across clinical, social, cognitive, developmental, experimental, psychopathology. I had no idea what I was doing. No idea what I was doing. And I got into four places, and I ended up choosing Bob Sternberg at Yale University. And even then, I wrote. I had stopped writing fiction. I realized I was good, but I wasn't good enough. But I had turned to plays because dialogue was always my favorite thing. And I mean, my first 2 years at graduate school, I didn't enjoy what I was doing at all, but I was writing all the time, and I was writing plays, and this was the early days of the internet, and I put them out there, and they would get picked up and put on all sorts of places. And it wasn't until, and I guess we're kind of shifting a little bit away from writing, but it wasn't until the end of my second year, and Bob said, you need to find something that you care about in psychology, because I did the world's worst master's thesis on Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, except I didn't even do it well enough to measure it. And I thought, well, I like creative writing. Maybe I'll study creative writing. I don't know. And so Bob gave me this list of 5 or 6 books, and I spent the summer in my parents' basement reading. And it was the first psychology stuff that actually was interesting. Actually, the very first book I read was Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's Creativity. It was magnificent, absolutely magnificent. And
Oh, that
he was an amazing man, wasn't he? Just amazing. Even when I discovered creativity, I kept writing plays. I wrote a musical, which years later was produced in New York City, which was fantastic. Really wasn't until my first year out of graduate school, working at Educational Testing Service, that the psychology part began taking up so much time and just brain that I just didn't have the time to do both. And so I stopped writing for a while, and then a while became a long time. And I mean, I still do every so often, but honestly, I get the same gratification and the same meaning from some of my creativity writing, not all, but I do these every so often. I do these solo books. So the Creativity Advantage, Creativity 101, and it's the same mix of my thoughts and stories and often stream of consciousness that I would do in my plays. So it ultimately, I am still writing, just quite differently.
Well, your new book, The Creativity Advantage, to me, it seems like a very personal book. The second half of it, which I'd like to talk about later in the podcast, is research contributions, but you have a lot in it, which was very personal and autobiographical. So that's where I learned things like you went from the MFA program to the cognitive psychology PhD
Yes.
program. So yeah, the book, I agree. It's very personal.
It's funny because there are some stories I tell in the Creativity Advantage or in 101. I mean, some of them are not that different from some of the stories that I put in characters' mouths in my musical Discovering Magenta or a few other ones. Because some of the stories that to me have a kind of a larger implication, they can be used to, hey, here's an example of this, but it can also be used as a good character story.
Right. And writing for a general audience, or what we call a trade audience, it really is about telling stories. Sometimes you hear this term narrative nonfiction. So you've done a good job with that in the new book. And also, yes, Creativity 101, which been around for a long time. What was it, 2008 or 2009 or so? And now you have a second edition of that book. And for those of you out there who don't know the book, it's a accessible introduction and overview to creativity research.
Thank you. Yeah, there were 2 editions. I kind of did Creativity Advantage instead of a third edition, and I doubt I'll do a third edition. Just less something I want to keep revisiting, but it was a lot of fun to do.
Right, right. Yes, and a wonderful book. It's one of your 50 books that I have on my bookshelf. So, in the introduction to the podcast, I said, you have 50 books. And I said, I don't have all 50 on my shelf, but I have more than a handful. And I think that's true of pretty much all creativity researchers. You've such a contribution to the field, especially these edited volumes. I think the first time we worked together was when you invited me to write a chapter for a book that you edited, came out in 2005. You co-edited it with John Baer, and it's called Creativity Across Domains, where you had one chapter for each creative domain, and you had an expert doing research in that domain as the author of that chapter: poetry, computer science, teaching. And I was already known at that time for my research on jazz and theater. So you asked me to write the chapter on acting.
Yes, I remember because my editor for that book, who I worked with many times, Phil Laughlin, he's now at MIT. He had suggested, because I couldn't find anybody to do acting, and this is, oh Lord, that was almost about 20 years ago, and so now there's so much more research. But back then, creativity was still, you had this boom of work in the 70s, but it was still finding itself. And Phil knew your work, and he said, "Oh, you got to check out Keith Sawyer." And I was like, "Oh, this is great." And then I've been following your work ever since. And I don't want to think about how many chapters I've pestered you for since then.
Right, right. And yes, and you have a new book coming out, and I've agreed to write a chapter for that one. I wanted to say a little bit about how big a deal it is to edit a book, because I think a lot of listeners won't know what that means. In academic publishing, an edited book means that you, James Kaufman, are the editor, you're essentially like a project manager, and your job is to curate the field, research in a particular topic like theater, creativity, for example. And then you have to decide what are the best subtopics of that. So those are going to be the chapter titles. And then you have to decide who is the most senior scholar out there who's an expert in that chapter topic. So you have to go invite each of those senior scholars and somehow convince them to write a chapter for your book. And it's a huge amount of work. Your name goes on the cover. You don't write every chapter, right? You write the introduction, you write the conclusion, perhaps, and all these senior scholars write all the chapters. But then you have to take the chapters and edit them and revise them. I've edited some books myself, but you have edited maybe 10 times as many books as I have. And I am always trying to explain to people, he didn't write the book, but it's really as much work as writing a book. So, yeah, why is that? This is just a huge contribution to creativity research. How did you end up being such a good editor? How do you come up with new topics for a book? How do you identify the senior scholars to write the chapters? Yeah, tell us a little bit about what's involved with that edited book.
Absolutely. It's funny. The analogy more than project manager is almost like assembling a fantasy baseball team, if anybody plays fantasy baseball, where you want to think of it's funny in a certain way. It's almost like, well, how would you try to describe a creative project in that you want some things to be a little surprising. You want to find people who aren't always the obvious choices. So if you're doing a regular edited book, that's where you think of a concept, a topic that's important or more likely of interest to you. And usually is about 14 to 16 chapters or so. And you want to get a couple of people who are big names, or the publisher will go, oh, okay, these are big names. You want a number of people who indeed are the established experts, the senior scholars, the people who could write the chapter with both eyes closed. But then you also want a little bit of a mix. So I like to get a couple of people who are earlier career, where it's kind of a exciting thing for them to be in the same book with all these big names. I like to get a couple of people who might not even think of themselves as studying creativity, but it's close. And so they will be able to kind of riff on the creativity aspect and bring their expertise on this other area. I like to make sure I get as diverse a group as possible. I like getting people from around the world who can represent different cultures, different philosophies. It's kind of like a recipe where you're looking for things that go well together and that are more than just the sum of the parts. A handbook is a little different because that's when you're creating a real reference work. And that's where it's okay, there need to be chapters on these topics, and there should be chapters on these topics. And another big difference is if you're editing a regular book, if somebody drops out, it's not the end of the world. I mean, it's not great, but it happens. If you're doing a handbook, I mean, people will still drop out, but if they're doing a topic that is an essential part, you need to figure something out pretty quick. Particularly for a handbook, the question of reliability comes into play, of people are going to deliver. The way I got started, I mean, having Bob Sternberg as a mentor was wonderful. I knew that I wanted to do a book with him. I remember my first couple of years just bringing ideas for edited books, and yeah, nope, nope, nope. We were flying to a conference together. I remember we were talking, and he was mentioning an idea he had for an edited book, and I could tell he was a little not thrilled to be flying. And I'm like, well, I could help. And that was actually the first edited book we did together, and it was on the evolution of intelligence. And I was not an expert in that. I'm still not an expert in that, but it taught me how to do it. I love collaborating. And so most of my edited books are with at least one other person. I mean, some of that is that I am not the most conscientious person in the world. And it's always good for me to be paired with somebody who will make sure that deadlines are met and so on. But it's also just I like working with people. It's fun. What it means is whenever I think, ooh, this might be an interesting edited book, it's very often, sometimes it's out of a conversation with somebody. Sometimes it's an idea I have and I think of who might be a good person to do it with. I mean, the things that I love about editing books, I mean, I love assembling the lineups, like I mentioned. I also love the fact that it makes you an instant expert in something. if I look back, a lot of the edited books are on topics I was interested in. And then after reading 15 or 16 chapters, it's like you have this instant education by the people you've picked. There's usually one or two fires to put out in terms of a chapter, maybe that wasn't quite what was expected. But by and large, you get to learn stuff, think about things. You get to know all sorts of great people. It's something that it takes a certain amount of practice and doing it just to learn how to do it. But once you know, it's like a jigsaw puzzle where if you've put together a number of jigsaw puzzles, you have a certain idea of, okay, first I do this and then I do that, and it's enjoyable and sometimes frustrating, but then it's fun at the end.
Well, just so the listeners know how productive you are, you have published 19 edited books just with Cambridge University Press and other edited books with other publishers. 19 books that we're talking about you going through this process. The handbook is a type of edited book that's something like a textbook. Yeah, like you say, where you really need to cover the key topics in the field. And you in 2010 published the book called The Cambridge Handbook of Creativity, which means that handbook has really everything that creativity researchers have discovered, one chapter at a time. So you are the one who divides up all of the research in the field into individual chapters. So that all by itself takes a huge, broad expertise. Like you have this integrative, holistic thinking ability that I think is so impressive.
Thank you. And that was particularly special because during that summer in my parents' basement, Bob had just finished getting the chapters in for his 1999 Handbook of Creativity. And I printed all of it out. And so I had this huge box filled with like 600 pages. That was another big entryway, the chapters in that book. And getting to do, I mean, it was considered the first edition because it was the official Cambridge Handbook series, but in my mind, it
Sure.
was very much in that tradition. And getting to do that and then the revision, it was an honor. It was exciting. I mean, I love working with Bob. It's a chance to it's a very rare chance to kind of shape a field where if you think something's important, you make sure there's a chapter. If you think somebody's work is important, it's a chance to, I mean, in a sense, assemble the textbook that you wish existed, and now it exists.
Right. And after having that level of expertise and breadth of knowledge of the field, then when you write your own book, like Creativity 101, readers can be confident that you have put everything in it that you need to know about creativity is going to be in Creativity 101 because you are familiar with all of it. I'd say an expert in all of it from editing all of these different chapters. You have to become a little bit of an expert in everything, right?
Yes, although I got to say, I think that your own textbook, I'm not sure you'd call it exactly, but your own overview of the field, which I believe the third edition is coming out soon, I think that's much more comprehensive than 101. Particularly the second edition. It was one of the best revisions of a book I've ever seen, where I think you added like 8 or 9 chapters. It was like, oh, wow. It was actually a contributing factor in not doing a third edition because when I did with the first 101, it was like, okay, well, there isn't something out there that I want. And your second edition, like, you know what? This is the one I'd have my students read. I don't need to do another version of it. I can do my own more esoteric stuff.
Right. Well, thank you for those kind words. Yes, the book Explaining Creativity, which I wrote as a textbook. Yeah, that was my intent. First edition in 2006, where it wasn't quite, I didn't quite get it right. And then the second edition in 2012, you're right. It was a complete rewriting and it was like the Bible of creativity. It was over 500 pages. Whereas your book, Creativity 101, is much thinner and it's more accessible. I have to say, the book Explaining Creativity, my textbook, it's probably not the book that just the general reader would buy. It's really for maybe advanced undergraduates or graduate students. But your book, Creativity 101, I think anyone could buy that and learn from it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So you've spanned all of these areas. I'm thinking about this list from your CV of the books that you've edited, and this is only a partial list: video games and creativity, animal creativity, creativity assessment, movie creativity, ethics and creativity, neuroscience and creativity, humor and creativity. And there's more. And each one of these is an edited book that you did, you conceived. People would say you curated the research in that field. So, yes, that's something I'm just so awed that you have this ability to do this and to do it so well. I think it's a gift to people in the field because you're doing this curation, and other people can go to your book and they can trust that this is really the source for information in, let's say, animal creativity.
Thank you. I'd taken a little bit of a break from editing just because I think I did a few too many, but I'm starting to tiptoe back and just got a contract for one on creativity and artificial intelligence, putting together a proposal for a new, different type of Cambridge handbook with actually, among others, a former student of mine who's now a professor. It's still fun. It is certainly work, but the nice thing is that if you get the right folks on board, they give you good stuff, make some suggestions, and then it all comes together. I often think of the musical Sunday in the Park with George by the late Stephen Sondheim, where George Seurat, the painter, after one session, he just says, "Look, I made a hat where there never was a hat." And it's something small. It's a hat. It's not the whole painting. But it's this idea of there's a certain sense of, yes, good. Like not necessarily pride as much as, isn't this cool? That this book that didn't exist, it now exists. And, it's not going to be a bestseller, but there will be people who will read it. There'll be graduate students and maybe some advanced undergraduates who get turned on to part of the field. And certainly, I mean, I think of the way the 99 handbook was for me, and the idea that, for example, that the two Cambridge handbooks might be that for other students is absolutely thrilling.
Well, it's interesting that you say you've taken a pause from editing, and that leads me to the next topic I wanted to talk about, which is your 2023 book, which is called The Creativity Advantage. And that one is not an edited book. That's a book that you wrote and presents a view of creativity that I think is very much consistent with the research that creativity has these advantages, that engaging in creative behavior, engaging in the creative act increases your well being and your psychological state of mind. Yeah, give us a summary of that book, The Creativity Advantage.
Absolutely. The genesis came from a paper I did on creativity and meaning, where I began thinking about these larger issues for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is that the thing that still is probably first if you Google me is the Sylvia Plath effect. It was a stupid little study that I did. I actually did it in graduate school. It was published right after I graduated. It looked at eminent writers and then eminent women, and it found that female poets were more likely to show signs of mental illness than other eminent writers or other eminent women. And it was honestly, it wasn't that interesting. I mean, it was fine, but it got a lot of media attention. I was a little flip until I realized that people cared about this and that some people felt seen, some people felt worried, some people felt sad. And you kind of think, wow, is this what I want to be remembered for? The other thing was my father, in the span of 6 months, had a very serious heart attack and was diagnosed with stage 4 bladder cancer. I went out to spend the summer with my parents thinking it was going to be kind of say goodbye. One thing I would do after they went to bed was read things on meaning, read Viktor Frankl, read Robert J. Lifton. And then it got me thinking, and I wrote this piece about creativity and meaning and how creativity could help people find meaning in the three broad types of meaning: coherence, which is making sense of your life, and significance, which is feeling like you live a life that matters, and purpose, which is kind of looking towards the future. Against all odds, my dad beat cancer, and knock on wood, is cancer free and still doing well. Right as I was finishing up that article, I had gotten my second revise and resubmit. I had a heart attack. I was changing planes and was running for a plane, and luckily I didn't make it because I don't know what would have happened if I'd gotten on the plane. I had some stents put in, I had a heel, and the first thing when I got back to work was to finish this paper, and I realized I want to expand it. I want to really, when you face the possibility of death, you're like, well, what do I want to be remembered for? And obviously, you have a lot of things that aren't work. I mean, I have a wife and two wonderful boys, Jacob and Asher. But do I really want the Sylvia Plath effect to be the only thing that? So the creativity advantage was came out of that, where The first half was like a mini creativity 101, where I just wanted to give a brief history, not history, but a brief overview of creativity. And I realized that the theme that is very consistent throughout most of my theories is the idea of inclusivity and the idea that anyone can be creative in some way. And this runs through, I mean, the first theory I did, really, it was Bob Sternberg's theory. Me and Gene Pretz helped flesh it out and develop it and write about it. But it was the propulsion model, which is different ways that people can be creative in terms of advancing the field. And one of them is replication. And that's doing your version of something. And it's intended as a low level, but it's also important that it still counts. That, if you're drawing your version of the Mona Lisa, it may not feel like it counts as creative just based on the standard definition of new and task appropriate, but it's new to you. And then my main theory is the four C's, which I developed with Ron Bigetto. And again, this idea that you had little c and big C, and we added mini C and pro C, where mini C is this personal creativity. That's a thought that might occur to you and it's meaningful to you, and maybe you never express it. Maybe you express it and people hate it. But again, it still counts. More recently, I've done some theoretical work with Vlad Glavinov. And again, a lot of it is the hidden creativity, the creativity that people might not even be aware counts. And so the first half, I really try to lean into that and this idea that everybody can be creative. I mean, all of my domain work is about, it's not just the arts or perhaps and business and science. It can be almost anything. And then the second half, I decided instead of the main three meaning components of coherence, significance, and purpose, I wanted to expand in different ways based on what's out there with creativity. And so I had one chapter on self insight, which was really coherence. And a lot of that's the writing cure and just things about how creativity can help people make sense of their lives and all the narrative work and just the way that being creative in these ways can help things make sense.
Right. How is it that being creative can enhance self insight? Self insight being the first of the five that we're going to talk about. So, how is it that creativity has that power, that ability to increase your self insight?
A lot of it is through these narratives where there's a lot of research. And again, this part is not my own research, but a lot of research showing that with regular expressive writing, if it's in narrative form, it kind of cleans up your mind. You have all these thoughts, worries, and things, and it cleans it up. It leaves, so to speak, extra room, which is a way of reducing stress. People who do this regularly tend to be in better physical and psychological health. A lot of narrative stuff is used for more end of life, being able to look back, memoirs and things like that to tell your story, which is itself a creative act. It's related to identity. And in adolescence, it's this development of who you are. And in older adults, it's this looking back and taking stock of who you were. Have you learned? Have you grown? I mean, being honest, there was the least work on this than the other four chapters. Um, but I felt it was still important.
Right. Interesting to me that when you're introducing these five, you point out that of all creativity research, 80% of it studies the variables that contribute to greater creativity, and only 20% of it studies the impacts of engaging in creativity. And that's your book, The Creativity Advantage, these effects or impacts of engaging in creativity. Did I get that right?
Yes, it's something I noticed the more I would do consulting, like with education or businesses, that there was always the person who brought me in, who knew that creativity was important. But then in talking to other people, like their superiors, if people ask you, well, okay, but why? Why does it matter? It's a weird question to have to answer. I remember giving a job talk for an education job, and somebody asked, in essence, how is creativity part of education? We know if you take millions of dollars and put it into reading or motivation, what will happen? What would happen? What would be the point? Why would it matter if you could do all this in creativity? And honestly, I didn't have a great response, and I didn't get the job. But it made me think. I mean, how do you convince people? Because if we study creativity, we value it. Of course, we think it matters. And having to defend it feels a little counterintuitive because it's not that, because people won't usually say creativity doesn't matter as much as why does it matter more than other things? If I have a limited budget or if I have limited time, why should I develop my workers into being more creative and having them be more loyal or more conscientious? If I have limited time for my or resources for the students, do I want them to be more creative or do I want them to be better test takers? These are hard questions to answer. I mean, certainly creativity can be in anything and it's not a this or that type of thing. I mean, creativity is associated with grades and test scores and all this. I mean, conscientiousness is associated a lot more. And it got me really kind of fascinated. Well, what can we point to? Because if we're asking for, okay, yes, you should invest money, I mean, not just as a consultant, but in grants and all of this stuff, we need to be able to show here's why, here's what it'll do. It's where a lot of this came from. And what's been great is that there has been some more work on this. I mean, I've been starting a whole bunch of new empirical studies with a lot of different collaborators on this, but I've also been really excited to see more and more work on these positive outcomes that has continued to grow.
Well, that leads me to the second one, first one being self insight. And you mentioned several times just now healing, which is the second way that creativity enhances life. Yeah, could you tell us a little bit about how creativity contributes to healing?
Absolutely. In a sense, the larger issue would be well-being, and creativity and well-being are related, but in a similar way as creativity and grades, in that it's positive, but it's not overwhelming. But if you dive deeper, creativity has these very specific strengths. I mean, some of it is that being creative tends to be enjoyable. I mean, I think particularly just the last 10 years or so with kind of the world being a trash can fire, anything that gives a little bit of joy in our lives and lets us focus on that instead of what's happening in the world, I mean, that kind of does wonders. And there's been a lot of studies of this that drawing, writing, and other stuff, if you are focused on positive distraction, it improves mood. A lot of this is by Jennifer Drake. And I'm actually excited to be working with her now on a couple of studies, kind of exploring this in a couple of different directions. I mean, some of it is also this idea of cognitive appraisal, which I find fascinating. This idea that the ability to look at things that have happened to us in our life, often bad things, and be able to see, okay, yes, this bad thing happened. However, because this happened, it had these ramifications. Other different things happened, and there might be a silver lining. So it's not that we're saying, oh, bad things happened and that's good, but we can recognize that life is complex. I mean, if I look back, like anybody else, there's been these, various things that weren't great. But whether it's my own personal growth or because of this, I met this person who's close to me or whatever, it's a way of taking stock and being able to see the often hard to immediately see positive impact of things. It's a very similar mechanism to divergent thinking. So instead of generating many new ideas, it's generating many different ramifications, outcomes of an incident. And that is such an important process and mechanism.
I think there's been a lot more research on this topic, creativity and well being. As a matter of fact, you mentioned my creativity textbook, Explaining Creativity. The second edition came out in 2012, we were just talking about. And the third edition came out in January. I co authored it with Dana Hendrickson.
Mhm.
And she suggested a new chapter on creativity and well being because there'd been so much research interest since we published, or since I published the 2012 version. So, yes, I'm glad to hear you talking about this and that you have it in your book as the second advantage. We'll call it the second advantage of creativity. And then moving on to the third one, which is connection. Yeah, what do you mean by connection?
Connection is how we feel tied to other people. There's a whole bunch of stuff I talk about in the chapter, but the thing that I find most interesting and the stuff that I've been doing a lot of work on is this idea that a lot of the traits associated with creativity, openness, tolerance of ambiguity, not needing as much structure or closure, they're also associated with equity. people who are less prejudiced, people who are less likely to stereotype or be biased. One of my graduate students who just got her PhD, Dr. Sarah Luria, is looking at what she calls an equity orientation. So somebody who believes that equity is important and this is something that is meaningful to them, they're more likely to be creative. And there is this creative people are more likely to want equity. And this is a line of research that she and I have been exploring and planning some additional studies. And there's little pockets of work, more and more stuff has been done on this. This idea of how people who are creative are more likely to be the people who will fight for justice and equality. And also, in a certain way, a totally different way, if we look at the measures, the assessments that are used for almost any high stakes moment, seeing who gets into gifted programs, seeing who gets into college or graduate school or law school or medical school and so on, almost all of these measures show differences by gender, ethnicity, and culture. And creativity measures tend to show either much fewer differences or no differences. These measures still aren't used. They're used for giftedness, but almost no colleges or graduate schools or institutions use creativity as any type of metric for people to be admitted. One project I'm working on with a lot of other different people, including Adam Green, who is leading it, is looking at ways of automatically assessing admission essays with an eye for creativity, ideally for the intention of improving diversity and helping equity.
Well, one thing I really like about your work is that it moves beyond the stereotype of creativity being, oh, I don't know, wild and crazy or something that is so different from school that you can't assess it, because you have a book, 2014, called Teaching Creativity in the Common Core Classroom, which I've read, and it shows, or you argue, that creativity is not incompatible with having some sort of standards. And you've also published books and articles about intelligence and intelligence testing, which a lot of people would think, oh my God, that's inimical to creativity. And I don't think so. I think that creativity can be balanced with constraints. And I think creativity and assessment it's an important link. So I'm glad to see that in your work as well.
Thank you. It's funny. People who identify as creative, I mean, a lot of times they don't love the idea of assessing creativity. And I mean, I understand that, but we don't value what we can't assess. People hate the SATs, but it's an assessment, it's a measure, and so it can be used. I mean, it's also worth noting, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of the SATs or anything, but if you look at the things that people suggest using instead, like personal essays or GPA, they actually show larger differences by ethnicity and by SES than the SATs. So again, I'm not saying the SATs are great, but you need something to replace it with, or else nothing changes. And
Good point.
yeah, it's I mean, it's the same way I think it really would not be impossible to include creativity on IQ tests, particularly given IQ tests are given one-on-one. You have a trained examiner who uses their own judgment to give, 0, 1, 2 points. It would be doable to have them apply the same type of thing to some subtests that would also tap into creativity. I mean, I don't see that happening anytime soon. A lot of that is that IQ tests, it's a business, and that's ultimately driven by what is feasible. And there's no particular incentive for the publishers to make any major change. I mean, the last tests that really tried to be innovative for a major IQ test was my parents' work. I mean, I think it's great. I just wish they have so many more ideas that I think would be wonderful to see. But you do what you can.
Well, of the 5 ways that creativity enhances life, those 5 creativity advantages, we've done the first 3: self insight, healing, and connection. So the fourth one you call drive. What is that? How does creativity contribute to drive?
Drive is largely motivation with an emphasis more on the intrinsic aspect and this idea of what makes us need and want to do something. I've gotten much more into creativity and motivation where it's a weird paradox. There's a ton of work on it, but almost all the work largely still uses this intrinsic extrinsic dichotomy. And I mean, it's a good one, but I'm interested in seeing things that are developed more specifically for creativity. And there's just been a couple of recent things on it. And then I'm working on a number of other projects, including kind of a big one at why do people create, and trying to look at these underlying needs and motivations beyond just intrinsic extrinsic. I mean, Marie Forgiard, who I did the paper on the predictor versus outcome on creativity with, like she did this magnificent study on pro-social motivation. Again, something different. I love it. In the work that we're doing, I mean, me and some other folks, again, it's like, could healing be a motivation or expression? Or I think we have about 12 to 15 that we've been getting out of these open-ended responses, and we're hoping to then develop more of a traditional measure. Ideally, be able to look at why do people create with a bit more nuance and complexity than is currently done. So less of this or that, and which is better, and more of a profile and a pattern.
Well, you've just given a great example of what makes creativity research different from personal anecdotes of managers or artists. You have this more reliable, more rigorous, you're truly focusing on generalizable findings of, as you say, intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, very longstanding topics in creativity research. And yes, your point resonates with me that we can develop those concepts further in the context of creativity. So, the fifth advantage of creativity you call legacy. And for me, I think that makes more sense in the context of your book, which to me seems very autobiographical, and maybe even in a sense, part of your own legacy is to capture this narrative, as you say, personal narrative of your life. The first of the five advantages, self insight. I think you've done that with this book. And then the fifth one you call legacy. So, how does creativity contribute to legacy?
That summer that I spent with my parents, not the one in their basement, but the one more recently, reading about meaning, one of the things that most captured my interest was this idea, and it originated with Otto Rank, but Robert J. Lifton really just beautifully expanded it. It's this idea of symbolic immortality. I mean, everybody's going to die. And it's a little surreal in that nobody regularly talks about it. I mean, and not like it's horribly taboo, but people tend not to just talk about in their daily conversations, oh, well, we're going to die. How do you feel about that? What Lifton did was we argued, like, one of the things that keeps us sane is the idea that even after we're actually dead, part of us can live on in kind of this metaphoric way. I mean, certainly creativity is not the only way. So Lifton, again, modifying off Rank, had these five pathways. One was creativity, obviously, and I'll come back to that. But there's also the idea of children, having kids, but can also mean fostering kids, nurturing kids, mentoring. I mean, teaching. How many, I mean, maybe not young children, but how many undergraduates have both of us taught over our career? And I mean, not that necessarily we've changed that many people's lives, but I hope we've changed some. Another one is religion or spirituality, almost taking this idea of symbolic immortality literally. And well, if I am religious, then I can go to heaven and live forever, or maybe I'll be reincarnated, or things like that. There's nature and this idea that my body may break down, but it will let the trees grow, and the idea that there is nature now that was there 1,000 years ago and will be here 1,000 years from now. And then there's this idea of experiential transcendence, or kind of living life as much as possible for these magic flow like moments that are intense and optimal experiences. And this can be so many things, anything from fighting to love to intense athletics, and these things that trigger that adrenaline. I mean, going back to creativity, I mean, to a certain degree, if we think about big C or creative genius, that's one of the markers. Does it outlive you? And we think, I mean, okay, I mean, William Shakespeare died hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and yet his plays still speak to us. Same with the great composers and the great artists. To a certain degree, that's true of what we call pro C, or just the experts, the professionals. Maybe we don't remember a whole lot of them from 400 years ago, but their work will still stand. I mean, whether it's the people who worked on a project, the people who worked on building some of the great architectural marvels, or the people who contributed in all these different small ways to the various legendary monuments or works that survive today. But the thing is, at a smaller scale, it's true for all levels. It's not just, can I create something that is so profoundly important that everybody's going to want to remember it and it'll keep being important for years and years after I die. It's the smaller things. My grandma Blanche, my dad's mom, she died almost 25 years ago. She died only a few months after I met my wife, Allison. We were very close. She was a wonderful, sweet person. She painted her last 10, 15 years. She did many paintings, and being very honest, she was good. She wasn't great. It's not like these paintings are things that you would expect to see in a museum, but they're pretty, they're nice, they're like flowers. And we have two of her paintings of flowers in our living room, and I see them every morning, and it makes me think of her and smile. It's her creativity living on. I feel like, I mean, how many of us have, if not paintings, then a recipe book, a photo album, or just stories from relatives who are long gone and maybe passed down through generations? And I feel like this counts, that even if it's just your family or your community who might remember, your creative efforts can still live on and keep part of you alive, even if you're not creative with a capital C.
Well, you just gave me a new idea I hadn't thought of before. I'll connect that to intrinsic motivation. Going back to your book, you mentioned a lot of the humanist psychologist, and you quote Erickson at one point, his concept of generativity, which means moving beyond one's own interest to boost future generations. So, really, you're thinking outside of yourself and you're thinking about the future in a way that's kind of problematic for the notion of intrinsic motivation, right? Because in intrinsic motivation, you're focused on attaining the flow state of peak experience. So, in a sense, it's very internal, it's very in the now. But with legacy, you're thinking about a gift, right? A gift to the future. So, you are thinking outside of yourself in that case, right?
Exactly. And it's one reason why I'm interested in looking beyond intrinsic extrinsic. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a very important distinction. But there are a lot of ways where if you are thinking too much of legacy, you could argue it's extrinsic, and yet it's not extrinsic in the way we tend to think of it. There's not this obvious reward or evaluation. I mean, there's the idea of evaluation. I mean, it's similar to pro-social motivation, where Marie Forgiard, discusses it, and you can be extrinsically motivated to help other people. And so, if you're just looking intrinsic, extrinsic, that could be extrinsic. But that's very, very different than if here you draw a picture, I'll give you $10. Things are more complex.
Well, thank you for that. We're getting to the end of our time, and I'd like to ask you, on behalf of our listeners, do you have a piece of advice, something they can do in the next week that would enhance their creativity and then might contribute to one of these five advantages?
The thing that I keep coming back to are the moments of joy, and the idea that being creative doesn't mean it will bring you joy. And certainly there are 10,000 reasons to be creative that may have nothing to do with joy, but to not overlook that to have genuine enjoyment, passion, love as a motivating factor for your creativity is something that isn't always thought of. I mean, even intrinsic interest is often about growth or interest in the process. And then that's important, of course. Like if you were to ask me, why do I collaborate so much? And I really collaborate a lot. I mean, a lot of it is that the people who I regularly and repeatedly collaborate with, particularly over years, I mean, these are people who I love. They're friends and colleagues and people who I enjoy spending time with. And co-creating with people who you care about, it is a way to feel joyful on so many levels. And the idea that then what could come out of it could still be meaningful and important and help others, I mean, I feel like you can't go too wrong with that.
Well, that really is profound advice, and thank you so much. Well, thank you, Professor James Kaufman, for joining today on the Science of Creativity. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to see who else you get on here. And I'm really excited that you are launching this terrific effort.
Well, thank you so much. I've learned a lot from today's interview and from Dr. Kaufman's book, The Creativity Advantage. His research is consistent with everything I know about creativity, about how creativity improves our personal well-being. Engaging in creative acts enhances your life. What you create impacts the world for the better, and it improves your own mental state as well. Thank you to Dr. James Kaufman for his time with us today. Thank you for listening to The Science of Creativity. If you liked this episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast and please rate the show because that helps others like you hear about the show. Please write in the comments if you have requests or ideas for future episodes. I'll see you next time on The Science of Creativity for insights and inspiration about art, design, and invention.